I sent a divorce letter to my wife's table while she was dining with a strange man. I was there, hidden in a corner of the restaurant, watching from afar as she smiled, fixed her hair, and crossed her legs in that way that, for years, was unique to me. The waiter approached, handed her the white envelope with my name on the return address, and I watched it all. The moment she recognized the handwriting, the second her fingers trembled and her gaze flickered between fear and shame. She tried to hide it, smiled sheepishly, and continued talking to the man as if it were no big deal, as if life hadn't collapsed there, on that sheet of paper signed by me, telling her there would be no more us. While she laughed nervously and pushed her food around with her fork, I was already on my way home. I wanted to be there before her, sitting on the couch like a shadow of my former self, like the last living memory of the man who loved her. When the door opened and she got in, I realized she'd been crying in the car. Her eyes were red, and she walked as if carrying the weight of the world. When she saw me there, she stopped, frozen, as if time froze the moment the truth finds the culprit. I didn't shout, I didn't argue. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Don't worry, I already know what happened. I was the one who told the waiter to give you the letter." She mumbled something, her voice breaking, "That's not what you were thinking." And I, without anger, without irony, just with a weariness that came from my soul, replied, "I already know everything. I don't wish you harm or anything like that. I just want to move on and find someone who values my love. I hope you're happy with your choice." Then I stood up, grabbed my packed suitcase, and walked out the door without looking back. That was the last time she saw me before life took a turn for the worse. In the months that followed, I learned to breathe without her, to fill the void on the other side of the bed with silence and peace. I met a woman unlike anything I'd ever experienced. She wasn't perfect, but she made me genuinely laugh. She listened attentively. She made me feel worthy of love again. Meanwhile, my ex was a string of relationships that never lasted past 2 months. No man could fill the space I'd left, not for lack of trying, but because a lack of respect is a debt that pays back with interest. She tried to come back. One day, she rang my doorbell. When I opened the door, I found that same lost look from dinner. She had aged about 5 years in one. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes marked by the insomnia of someone who understands, too late, the value of those lost. She said she thought of me every day. That she missed our home, the scent of my perfume on her clothes, my calm, my caring nature. That I made mistakes, yes, but that she made mistakes too, and a lot of them. She said the man she left with that day disappeared weeks later, and that since then, she hadn't been able to find anyone who cared for her the way I did. I listened silently. There was no anger in me, but there was no more space either. The scar had already turned into new skin. And there, standing before the woman who broke my heart, I realized that love doesn't die, it just finds another place to blossom. She cried, begged for a second chance. She said she'd learned from the pain. That she now knew what she'd lost. And I calmly replied, "I don't hate you. But I've learned to love myself more than to insist on someone who didn't know how to choose me." And then I closed the door. Not with anger. With respect. With self-love. She stood there for a few minutes, until she realized that door would never open again. But what she didn't know, and what perhaps no one suspected, was what truly led her to lose the love of her life. Because there was a specific moment. A single scene that sealed her fate. And that scene wasn't dinner. It wasn't the letter. It wasn't even my leaving home. It was something that happened much later, when she thought she might return. Something she saw. An unexpected encounter. A reflection that made her face the cruelest truth: the love she destroyed had found a new home. A gaze that was no longer meant for her. And it was in that moment, and only in that moment, that she truly understood what she had lost. And when she Nuish saw this, maybe she understands why repentance doesn't always find forgiveness. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, and will never support, any form of cheating. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but based on real situations, created to show how much infidelity can destroy entire lives, loves and futures. Prepare to be immersed in intense emotions, unexpected twists and turns, and hard-to-face truths. Now take a deep breath, and be ready to listen. A shocking story. Her name was Laura. From a young age, she carried a tenderness in her eyes that confused maturity with fragility, but there was a quiet strength within her, shaped by the simple life she had led with her parents and two younger sisters. She was a high school literature teacher, passionate about words and the way they could save a soul in ruins. She was beautiful in a soft way, with discreet features and a lightness in her speech that charmed even the most skeptical. Daniel, on the other hand, was a civil engineer, meticulous, serious, but with a rare sense of humor that only revealed itself when he was at home, when he took off his shoes and relaxed in front of the sofa after a day of meetings and calculations. They met by chance, at a community event they both reluctantly attended, but which would ultimately change the course of their lives. At first, they seemed unlikely for each other. Daniel was methodical, extremely organized, with rigid schedules and an almost sacred relationship with silence. Laura, on the other hand, was chaotic in her sweetness, forgetting where she left her keys, arriving late for appointments, and constantly scattering books around the house. But perhaps it was precisely this contrast that brought them together. They complemented each other. And so, after just a few months of dating, they decided to share a home. It was in a single-story house on a corner, with a modest garden and a balcony where they would spend countless nights talking about life. Daniel planted the first flowers with his own hands, while Laura chose the curtains with the obsession of someone who believes that details are the soul of a home. The first few years were a time of learning and adjustment, like any true marriage. Daniel had to learn to compromise, to understand that the world didn't fit into spreadsheets, while Laura had to find a balance between her dreamy nature and the concrete reality of life as a couple. They fought, of course. Sometimes over trivial matters, other times over issues that dragged on silently until they exploded unexpectedly. But in each of these arguments, there was also a reunion, a hug in the middle of the night, an apology whispered between tears and smiles. There was love. A built love, not the intense, uncontrolled kind that appears in movies and collapses at the slightest breeze. It was a love of the flesh, with daily rituals, like the leisurely breakfast prepared on Sundays, the notes left on the refrigerator door, the simple messages in the middle of the day, "Are you home early today? I made lasagna, I miss you." They cultivated it with dedication. Their friends saw them as an example, as that couple who faced difficulties without ceasing to admire each other. And there was admiration, a lot of it. Daniel loved the way Laura spoke of her students, the sparkle in her eyes when she told a story or referenced a poem she'd read the night before. Laura, in turn, was proud of his unwavering ethics, the patience with which he dealt with problems, the loyalty with which he viewed life. They didn't have children, though they had considered it for a while. But the idea slowly faded, amidst other priorities, postponed trips, and deferred plans. Instead, they built a life of their own. Short holiday trips, evenings with wine and old movies, Sunday afternoons tidying closets or just lying on the rug talking about what they would do if they won the lottery. Time passed without them noticing. And at some point, hard to pinpoint, the words became shorter, the touches rarer, the kisses more formal. Routine took over subtly, like a slow-acting poison. They still loved each other, perhaps more out of habit than desire, but they couldn't name what was missing. Daniel started coming home later. Not out of disinterest, but because of the growing weight of his work responsibilities. The company promoted him frequently, and along with the bonuses came new pressures, new meetings that required all-nighters, new reports to present in places he didn't even want to be. Laura understood, or at least tried. She never complained. She had her own life, her projects with students, her books, her classes, her coffees with colleagues. But she missed him. Missed him. Missed his presence in her essence, not just in the tired body slumped on the couch at the end of the day. They began to live more like roommates than lovers. Conversations became messages, dinners lost their flavor, birthdays were reduced to messages with emojis. And yet, there was loyalty. They respected each other, looked at each other carefully, though the spark was no longer the same. There was still a silent hope that everything would fall into place. That perhaps it was just a phase, like so many others. Perhaps time, the same time that erased impulses, would also bring answers. Deep down, Laura harbored small aches and pains she never expressed. She knew Daniel loved her, but she felt as if he no longer saw her. It was as if she had become part of the scenery, the furniture, the predictable routine. She could no longer remember the last time he had looked at her with surprise, complimented her spontaneously, or desired her unhurriedly. She felt invisible, yet never abandoned. And this paradox gnawed at her silently. Daniel, however, immersed in his professional whirlwind, didn't notice his wife's small absences. He believed she was fine, after all, she never complained, never caused conflict, always greeted him with a calm smile. Little did he know that behind that smile lay unanswered questions. The outside scene was the same as always. The house remained tidy, the garden well tended, the neighborhood peaceful. Nothing on the outside indicated any cracks. It was the kind of life many envied. But inside, there were gaps. Silences that grew larger with each passing day. Daniel tried to compensate with gifts, last-minute trips, and occasional kindnesses. Laura smiled and thanked him, but the wound wouldn't heal with flowers. There was no presence. There was no truth. One afternoon, sitting alone on the sofa, Laura looked at a photo of the two of them, taken in Paris, during a trip they took in their 5th year of marriage. In that image, she was laughing with her eyes closed, and he was watching her as if she were the center of the universe. That photo brought tears to his eyes. Not just from longing, but because he couldn't understand where they lost each other, when they stopped being that. And yet, she didn't speak. She kept everything to herself. After all, she didn't want to be unfair to the man who always treated her with respect, who never raised his voice, who built every inch of that life with her. She simply wanted more. She wanted to feel. She wanted to be seen again like in the photo. The nights remained peaceful on the outside and silently dense on the inside. They slept in the same bed, but in different worlds. Sometimes they touched, sometimes they forgot to touch. Daniel, in the few moments of respite, tried to reconnect. He brought wine home, made her favorite dish, commented on a passage from the book she was reading. Laura smiled, but her soul no longer responded with the same enthusiasm. It was like trying to light a flame with wet matches. And yet, they continued. Because the love born of respect is more resilient than the love born of passion. And even though it was dormant, there was still something there that kept them together. The memory of everything they'd built, everything they'd overcome. The birthdays, the achievements, the difficult days overcome side by side. They were still a couple. But a couple adrift. And no one around them noticed. They went on with their lives. He at work, she at school. Weekend lunches, family visits, trivial conversations about bills, renovations, politics. From the outside, they still looked like a model couple. And maybe they were. But models break down too. And what no one saw was that, inside that silent home, two people screamed for attention. And neither of them knew how to ask for help. What still united them was the past. It was strong, solid, full of good memories. But is a happy past enough to sustain an empty present? That was the question Laura carried in her eyes, day after day. And Daniel, without knowing it, was perhaps the only person who could answer it. But he also had questions. And no courage to ask them. Because, deep down, they both knew that certain answers, once spoken aloud, could no longer be ignored. Laura began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. They weren't exactly signs, but subtleties, almost imperceptible noises that only those who live in silence can interpret. Daniel, always methodical, began to forget trivial commitments he would never let slip by. The good morning message became rare. The touch when he passed her in the kitchen was now absent, and their eyes took longer to meet. Laura attributed it all to fatigue, to the pressures at work, to the demands that seemed to grow like an invisible wall between them. But what disturbed her wasn't the absence, but the effort to maintain a presence that no longer pulsed with truth. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase, one of those tides all marriages go through, but there were nights when sleep wouldn't come, and she found herself staring at the ceiling as if it held answers Daniel was no longer capable of giving. On one of those sleepless nights, Laura got up slowly, walked to the living room, and sat in front of the bookshelf. She picked up an old volume of love letters from forgotten poets, a collection she used with her students to explain how time changes the language of love, but which now seemed to speak to her on a different frequency. She read a letter in which a man begged the woman he loved not to let silence kill them. It disarmed her. She slammed the book shut, took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, cried without trying to hold it in. What tore her apart was not the absence of gestures, but the absence of desire. The feeling that, even though she was there, within touching distance, Daniel no longer saw her as a woman, but as part of the scenery, like a familiar piece of furniture that was respected but no longer evoked any emotion. The next day, Daniel arrived home later than usual. Laura was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, with a cold plate of food in front of her. He came in, kissed her forehead, briefly commented on a meeting that had run long, took off his shoes, and went straight to the shower. Laura remained there, motionless, staring at the plate, as if waiting for him to say something else, something different. But nothing came. Only the sound of the shower, the bedroom door closing, and then the creak of the mattress as he lay down. She remained in the kitchen for a long time, smelling the basil she had used to season the sauce. It was his favorite dish, but he didn't even notice that. In the days that followed, Laura became more attentive to his movements, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity. She needed to understand how far his absence could go without her noticing. Daniel, on the other hand, grew increasingly impatient. He began responding in monosyllables, avoiding long conversations, pretending to go to bed early. And even when he tried to show affection, it seemed forced, disconnected from his soul. She could feel it. And it hurt her in a new, profound way. Still, she tried. She cooked dinner, left loving notes on the bathroom mirror, placed a flower in the glass on the living room table. He thanked her, smiled with his lips, but his eyes were elsewhere. One afternoon, Laura was surprised by a schoolmate with whom she often exchanged ideas about literature. He praised a class she had taught, commented that he admired her sensitivity toward students, and, unexpectedly, said it was rare to find people like her, who knew how to listen and feel for others. Laura smiled kindly, but inside something trembled. It wasn't exactly the compliment that touched her, but the fact that someone had truly seen her. She returned home with that comment echoing in her head. She thought about telling Daniel, sharing her feelings, but when he arrived, he was too tired to talk. He lay down on the couch, turned on the television, and fell asleep with the remote in his hand. Laura simply covered him with a blanket, turned off the lights, and went to her room alone. The following week, she decided to propose a weekend away, a short trip, just the two of them. He declined, saying he was swamped with commitments and couldn't be away. His refusal was cold, with no room for negotiation. Laura didn't insist. She just smiled, even as her heart sank into silence. She started hanging out more with her coworkers, extending coffee dates, accepting invitations to cultural events. She started wearing clothes that had been forgotten in the back of her closet, wearing lipstick even on ordinary days. Not out of vanity, but as an attempt to reconnect with herself. She needed to feel alive. Meanwhile, Daniel immersed himself even deeper in his own world. He'd started attending meetings in other neighborhoods, business meetings in restaurants, and corporate events. He said it was necessary, that the demands had increased. Laura didn't question him, it wasn't in her nature to control or distrust, but there was something in the tone of his apologies that hurt more than the absence itself. He was increasingly becoming a stranger in the house. And what she felt wasn't jealousy, but an existential void. A hole of doubts, of silent desires, of frustrations that seemed to scream between the lines. One Friday night, Daniel arrived later than usual. He smelled of a different perfume, not the one he usually wore every day. When she hugged him, she felt a slight discomfort in his gesture, as if the contact bothered her. She tried to talk, asking how the night had been, the event, but he responded with short, almost automatic sentences. After a few minutes, he went upstairs to his room. Laura remained there, standing in the middle of the living room, trying to understand why it hurt her so much. It wasn't just the smell. It was the distance. The way he avoided her gaze, the way he diverted the conversation, the way he seemed burdened with an unspoken guilt. In the following days, she began to observe his movements with a keener eye. She noticed he was using his phone differently, more reservedly. He spent a lot of time in the shower. He would get out of bed in the middle of the night, claiming he couldn't sleep. He would make up meetings on Saturdays. And even with all these changes, Laura didn't confront him. She kept every sign inside, in a place where her feelings mingled with the memory of the man for whom she would one day weather any storm. But silence has a limit. And it was broken one rainy night, when Daniel said he had a dinner with important clients and didn't know what time he'd be back. Laura simply nodded. When he left, she stared at the door for several minutes, feeling her chest tighten with something she couldn't yet name. Then, driven by a force she couldn't quite pinpoint, she got dressed, got in her car, and drove aimlessly for almost an hour. Until, by chance, she saw his car parked in front of a discreet, elegant restaurant. She stopped across the street and watched. She waited. When Daniel appeared, he wasn't alone. He was walking beside a woman, laughing, saying something that brought tears to her eyes. There was no touch, no kiss, but the look was enough. It was the kind of look she hadn't seen in herself in a long time. A look of enchantment, of attention, of desire. Laura needed no further proof. In that moment, she knew. It wasn't a suspicion, it was a certainty. Betrayal had a face, even if it didn't yet have a name. She rested her head on the steering wheel and stood there for minutes that felt like hours, feeling the world spin inside her chest. She wasn't crying out of anger. She was crying for everything she'd lost. For everything she believed in. For every word unsaid, for every silence swallowed. She returned home unsure of what to do. She didn't sleep that night. And the next day, she prepared everything with frightening calm. She went to the lawyer, wrote the letter, and put it in a white envelope. She called the restaurant, spoke with the waiter, and arranged the details. She was at peace. There were no more doubts, no more despair. There was only the certainty that this cycle had to end. Late that afternoon, she got ready, left the house, and headed to the dinner venue. Not to keep watch, not to confront. Just to ensure the delivery would take place. And when she saw the scene, the waiter approaching with the envelope in his hands, Daniel opening it with a curious expression, and then the shock, the attempt at disguise, his lost gaze trying to continue the conversation with the other woman, something inside Laura died, but another part was reborn. Hours later, Daniel entered the house. And when he saw Laura sitting on the sofa, her face calm and her bag beside her, reality hit him. She looked at him with calm but firm eyes. And before he could say anything, she took a deep breath and, in a low voice, said she knew everything. That she wouldn't make a scene. That she didn't want explanations. That she only hoped he would be happy with his choice. Then she got up, grabbed her bag, and left. Daniel stood there, unable to react. Dinner was still pulsing through his mind, the envelope still burning in his hands. I was trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. I was trying to imagine when she'd stopped being distracted enough to notice. But what he didn't yet know, what was yet to come, was that the true pain wouldn't be the separation. It would be the moment when, unintentionally, he would see something he'd never imagined. And there, before his very eyes, he would discover that there are consequences that arrive long after the choice, and that one can't always go back. The rain tapped lightly on the living room glass when Daniel closed the door, feeling the echo of Laura's absence still linger in the air. The suitcase was gone, her faint perfume had vanished from the entrance, and the walls seemed colder than ever. He walked through the house slowly, as if expecting to find her somewhere, even though he knew she was completely gone. He sat on the sofa and ran his hands over his face, trying to gather his thoughts, understand how it all happened, why he hadn't seen it coming. He picked up the envelope again, rereading the letter in her firm handwriting, direct words, without resentment, but with pain contained in every line. "I hope you are happy with your choice," it said at the end. It tore him apart inside, because he knew he hadn't made a choice at all. He had merely allowed time and neglect to lead him down paths he'd never had the courage to face honestly. But there was still something inside him that hurt more than the separation. It was the weight of regret that he still didn't know how to carry. In the days that followed, Daniel was plunged into emptiness. The silent house now felt strange, as if it had been invaded by ghosts carrying Laura's scent and memory in every detail. He couldn't sleep in his bedroom. He preferred the sofa, where he felt less like a traitor. He began to notice her gestures he'd previously ignored, the way she always left a clean towel folded in the bathroom, the way she arranged the pictures slightly askew without saying a word, her habit of leaving the remote control in the exact spot he liked. Small kindnesses that now screamed her absence in every corner. He tried calling her a few times, wrote messages he never had the courage to send, and with each failed attempt to reconnect, he felt even more unworthy. It was one afternoon, on his way back from the market, that he saw her. She was crossing the street next to a woman he'd never seen before, smiling with a lightness that hadn't existed between them for a long time. Daniel's heart sank, but it wasn't jealousy, it was a mixture of longing and guilt, as if he'd finally understood that losing someone like that was more than losing company, it was losing the chance to be better. He hid behind a car, like a foolish teenager trying to escape an inevitable truth, and stood there, watching her for a few seconds that seemed eternal. She laughed. And that laugh was like a slap in the face, not out of anger, but because it laid bare everything he'd stopped nurturing. He returned home with an empty chest and heavy eyes. There, he understood that he was no longer a part of her life. Time passed. A month, 2, maybe 3. Daniel no longer marked the days. He just lived, or tried to. Some people invited him out, some friends tried to pull him back into social life, but he gently declined. He was still trapped in a past too recent to overcome. But the pain was no longer raw, it was silent, a wound that healed slowly. Until one day, while organizing an old drawer in the living room, he found a letter Laura had written long before the separation. It was one of those letters she used to write and never deliver. The handwriting was shaky, and the words were filled with frustration. She said she missed him even when she was by his side. That she screamed silently every day, begging for attention, affection, desire. That she felt invisible. Daniel read it all as if reading a will of something that was already dead before it was even buried. He cried quietly, alone, unsure whether he regretted more having lost her or never having seen her properly. A few weeks later, he accepted a friend's invitation to a small charity event. He didn't want to go, but felt he needed to try something different. It was there that he met Helena. A sweet woman with a quiet smile and a voice like music at a low volume. They started chatting about trivialities, but soon they were laughing like old friends. Helena didn't ask about the past or force the present. She was light, sincere, and spontaneous. Daniel found himself listening attentively, asking questions with interest, feeling, for the first time in a long time, an uncomplicated connection. They went out a few times after that. He still carried his ghosts, but with her, they seemed less heavy. Laura, on the other hand, lived her days with a melancholic calm. She tried to move on, got involved in projects, rekindled old friendships. She had a few dates, but nothing lasting. All the men she talked to seemed superficial, anxious, incapable of deep diving. She compared unintentionally. None of them had Daniel's quiet, caring way. None of them knew the right amount of coffee, nor how she liked the light on only halfway in the room. One night, sitting with a glass of wine, she decided to visit the restaurant where she had previously dined. Something was pulling her there, perhaps an unconscious desire to confront that situation. She asked for the same table. The same dish. The same wine. The waiter recognized her but said nothing. He just smiled discreetly. As she was about to leave, she heard someone call her name. It was the same waiter, now with a serious expression. He approached and gently said he needed to share something he'd been keeping since that day. Laura raised her eyebrows in surprise. He then explained that, on the night of the dinner, he'd received specific instructions from Daniel. That he was the one who delivered the envelope. That he'd chosen the moment himself. And, above all, that before delivering it, Daniel had stood across the room for several minutes, observing her. "I've never seen a man look at a woman like that," the waiter said. It was like he was saying goodbye to the love of his life. That sentence struck like a bolt of lightning. Laura left the restaurant in a daze. She wandered the streets aimlessly, feeling a weight on her chest she hadn't felt since the day she closed the door to their house for the last time. That night, she didn't sleep. She kept sifting through memories, old photos, forgotten notes. She began to remember the details she'd ignored, his gestures she'd come to regard as routine, the attempts she perhaps hadn't acknowledged as she should have. She realized that, for a long time, she'd also been emotionally absent. That perhaps they'd both lost themselves not because of someone else's presence, but because they lacked the courage to face what was dying between them. But what crushed her inside was the realization that he loved her to the end. The next day, with her heart in tatters and her eyes weary, she made an impulsive decision. She drove to her old house. She stopped in front, checking for light. She took a deep breath and, without rehearsing, rang the doorbell. When the door opened, the world stopped. Daniel was there. Thinner, his face calmer. He wore a simple shirt, and his eyes held a serenity she had never seen before. Behind him, at the end of the hallway, there was a soft laugh. A feminine voice. Laura noticed. She felt the impact of reality, but she didn't back down. She said she needed to talk, that she had something to say. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then made room for her to enter. They sat in the living room in silence. She began, her voice breaking, saying she wasn't there to apologize or justify anything, but that she needed to talk. She recounted what the waiter had said, how it had hit her, how realizing he still loved her in that moment was the deepest blow she'd ever felt. He said no one else had looked at her the way he did. That no one else had made her feel safe, whole. That she tried to move on, but no one came close to even a shadow of what they'd shared. And that if he still felt something, anything, she'd be willing to start over from scratch. Daniel listened in silence. When she finished, he took a deep breath, looked into her eyes with a quiet pain, and told her that she had been the love of his life. That he loved her with all his heart. But that the moment she chose to be with another man, something inside him broke irrevocably. He said that, for the first time, he was able to look in the mirror and recognize himself again. That he understood that loving someone also means loving yourself enough to not accept crumbs. And that, now, he was happy. Not in the same way, but in a light, genuine way. That he didn't wish her harm, but that he could no longer return to a place where his love was put off. Laura tried to hold back her tears, but she couldn't. Her hands trembled, and her eyes filled with tears that flowed slowly. She asked for just one last thing, that he never doubt how much she regretted it. Daniel nodded, smiled sadly, and walked her to the door. When she left, he stood there for a few seconds, still. And when he turned to go in, he heard the soft laughter again, coming from the kitchen. The new woman in his life was calling him to dinner. And it was at that moment, as she walked back into the house, that Laura, outside, looked out the window and saw something that would forever change the way she remembered Daniel, he was embracing another woman with the same affection he once had for her. But it was a different love. A new love. One born there, in the place where hers had died. That night, after the silent farewell at the front door, Daniel didn't immediately return to the kitchen. He stood for a few moments in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, staring into the void before him with eyes filled with a past that no longer belonged to him. He could hear Helena's soft voice in the background, setting the table delicately, unhurriedly, without demands. It was a calm presence, one that didn't demand constant proof, but offered complicity in small doses, the kind that slowly heals the heart's traumas. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the intensity of what he had just experienced. Laura's words still echoed in his mind, not as a provocation, but like a newly opened scar, which, even healed, hurts again when touched too hard. The next morning, he decided not to comment on the reunion. Helena, sensitive as she was, sensed something different in the air, but chose not to ask. There was trust there, and also respect for the timing of things. Daniel left early for a walk, a practice he had recently incorporated into his routine as a way to find silence between thoughts. During the walk, his gaze wandered aimlessly, but his mind swirled in a whirlwind of images and voices. He relived the moment he saw Laura standing in the doorway, thinner, her face scarred by sleepless nights, and her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with admiration, now filled with a request that could not be granted. On the other side of the city, Laura felt the weight of reality with a force that took her breath away. She had left the house where she had once been happy, carrying a mixture of guilt, frustration, and regret that she couldn't hide. She didn't return to her apartment immediately. She drove aimlessly, her eyes filled with dried tears, her breathing ragged. She stopped in an old square, where she and Daniel used to stroll in the early years of their marriage. She sat on a bench and watched the dry leaves being carried by the wind. It was autumn, and there was something cruelly symbolic in watching the trees strip away what had once been life. For the first time, Laura understood that love, no matter how deep, cannot survive without care, without presence, without truth. In the following days, Daniel's routine remained serene. He continued with his projects, his coffees with Helena on Sundays, his walks on Saturdays. But there was a subtle transformation within him. Something that began to emerge silently, a sense of liberation. It wasn't relief at having left Laura behind, but the realization that, for the first time in many years, he was living a complete story, without loose ends, without ghosts haunting the hallways. Helena wasn't occupying Laura's space, she was building a new space, with new colors, new rituals. And Daniel allowed himself to feel, not with guilt, but with maturity. He hadn't just found love again, he had found himself again. Laura, on the other hand, plunged into a solitary process of reconstruction. She avoided going out, declined invitations, and spent hours rereading old diaries, trying to pinpoint when she began to drift away from the woman she once was. The guilt weighed heavily, but what hurt most was the certainty that her love for Daniel had never ceased, merely fallen asleep amid fatigue and routine. She wished she could go back in time, but knew that regret doesn't change the past, it only makes the present harder to bear. She wrote letters she never sent, letters in which she begged forgiveness not only from him but from herself, for having allowed her love to die of thirst in front of a full well. One night, Laura was invited by a friend to an art exhibition. She didn't want to go, but she was persuaded. The gallery was small and cozy, with soft lighting and instrumental music in the background. She walked among the paintings distractedly, without much connection to what she saw, until she stopped before a canvas that transfixed her. It was a portrait. And in that portrait was her. Her face, her eyes, her expression. Painted with painful precision. The painting's title was, "The Woman Who Chose the Void." Next to her name was the signature, D.C. The ground seemed to slip away from beneath her feet. She didn't know whether to cry, smile, or run away. She remained motionless for long seconds. Gradually, reality set in. Daniel had painted that painting. And it was displayed there, amidst his other works, all depicting repressed feelings, stark silences, people amid darkness and light. It was as if he had transformed his pain into art. Laura walked slowly through the other paintings, each with a unique intensity. In some, she recognized fragments of their lives: a balcony, a cup, a pair of clasped hands, an open window. When she left the gallery, she was different. There was acceptance on her face, a more resigned grief, as if she understood that certain losses are not punishments, but consequences. Life was moving on, and she needed to find meaning in other ways. She began investing more in her career, traveling, and reconnecting with old dreams. She began giving lectures on literature and emotions, helping others avoid making the same mistakes she had. Her words were now charged with real experience, with genuine pain, and deeply touched those who listened. Meanwhile, Daniel and Helena's relationship deepened. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was a process of construction. They had difficult moments, disagreements, adjustments. But there was communication. There was desire. There was daily choice. And that made all the difference. One day, Helena took him to a park where she used to go with her parents as a child. They sat on a hill to watch the sunset. Daniel, gazing at the horizon, held her hand and whispered that, for the first time in a long time, he felt peace. Helena simply smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and told him that his peace was hers too. A few weeks later, Laura received a letter at home. It was from the gallery. They informed her that the painting, "The Woman Who Chose the Void," had been sold, and that the buyer had left a note for her to deliver. The handwritten note simply said, "Every absence is a warning. But you taught me that some presences also scream. Thank you for setting me free." She read and reread that sentence dozens of times. She cried. But this time, it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a cry of liberation. From someone who finally understood the value of what she had lost, but also the value of what she could still become. She no longer tried to look for him. She no longer tried to return. She understood that true love also knows how to say goodbye with dignity. Months passed. A new cycle began for everyone. Daniel and Helena moved house. They chose a smaller, more welcoming place, far from old memories. They began planning a long trip, the kind he and Laura never managed to take. Laura, in turn, published a book, Letters I Didn't Send. A collection of reflections and stories about loss, choices, and silences. She became a reference among women seeking to rediscover their strength after broken relationships. She was sought out by young people, by couples in crisis, by people who, like her, learned the hard way that love needs to be cultivated, every day. One morning, their paths crossed again. By chance. In a bookstore. He was with Helena, browsing through photography books. She was alone, signing copies of her book. Their eyes met. For a moment, time stood still. She smiled. He did too. There was no more pain, no hurt, no desire. Only recognition. She approached, gently squeezed Helena's hand, and, looking into Daniel's eyes, said, "I'm happy for you." He nodded back, adding, "I'm happy for you, too." They exchanged a final glance and then continued on. Each to their own side of life. And in that silent farewell, without tears or long words, there was the conclusion of everything that once began with promises, passed through ruins, and now transformed into learning. They were no longer the same, and that was good. Because love, even when it dies, can leave seeds. And when those seeds bloom, stories are born that don't need a happy ending, just a true ending. The brief encounter in that bookstore wasn't the fresh start that Laura, in a secret corner of her soul, still held as a possibility, nor a sentimental settling of scores. It was, in fact, a silent turning point, a veiled but definitive goodbye. And after that, the days went by with a sense of unannounced closure, as if her heart finally understood that certain stories end not with slamming doors, nor with screams or tears, but with the simple act of moving on. Laura returned home that night with a weight less on her shoulders, even if the emptiness reorganized within her unexpectedly. There was there, more than longing or regret, the full awareness that time, while it doesn't heal everything, reveals. And what it revealed to her was that love isn't invincible, it needs to be cared for, respected, chosen every day. And when it isn't, it slips away. Without fuss, without drama. It just goes. Daniel, for his part, felt that farewell in his body, like someone closing a book that had marked their life but didn't want to reread. The reunion didn't shake the stability of the new life he was building, but it did bring to the surface a kind of delayed mourning. Because even though he had overcome it, even though he was at peace, there was a history of years that now rested definitively in the past, and that, in itself, carried a particular kind of pain. Helena noticed his prolonged silence that night, and he, with the honesty he'd cultivated since they'd allowed themselves to fall in love, told her he'd found Laura again. He spoke bluntly, without hiding the impact, but made it clear that it was just that, an impact. Something human, inevitable, and fleeting. Helena listened with the serenity of someone who knows the depths of the man she chose, and simply told him she didn't fear ghosts, for she knew the light between them wasn't a reflection of the past, but a new flame they both kept burning with truth. In the weeks that followed, Laura plunged into an even more intense process of internalization. She began attending emotional discussion groups, conversations about relationships, and meetings with women who, like her, had experienced the collapse of a love through neglect and pride. In each story she heard, she revisited pieces of her own. And little by little, she became a voice of support, a reference for overcoming, even though her heart still trembled when remembering the hands that had once touched her so gently. She began writing more, now not just letters that would never be sent, but chronicles, articles, and essays that deeply touched those who read them. There, she discovered a new version of herself, more mature, more honest, more willing to acknowledge her flaws as well as her merits. One day, at the end of one of her lectures, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. She said she had ended a 6-year relationship after hearing Laura talk about the price of not seeing the other person. The young woman thanked her, saying she had avoided greater pain in the future. Laura hugged the young woman tightly, as if hoping to prevent others from following the same abyss. And when she returned home, she sat on the porch, stared at the dark sky, and thanked, for the first time in a long time, for having survived it all without becoming bitter. She was no longer the betrayed woman, nor the woman who betrayed. She was someone who understood that wrong choices do not negate the ability to start over with dignity. Meanwhile, Daniel and Helena's routine was taking on new forms. They had recently moved to a house with a garden, and there, among lavender and rosemary plants, they began to write a whole new chapter. Daniel resumed his painting, now with a less melancholic outlook. His works, previously laden with shadows and figures in waiting positions, now featured landscapes, people in motion, bonds being forged. In one of the paintings, Helena appeared with her back to him, gazing at an open field. It was a portrait of the mutual freedom they experienced, being together, yet whole, without dependencies, without guilt. During an exhibition of his new works, a journalist approached him and asked if any of the paintings were inspired by his past. Daniel thought for a few seconds and replied that everything he creates is born from something he's experienced, but that now his art no longer carries pain as its primary fuel, but rather transformation. He said he only understood love today because he had already experienced the failure of what he thought was love. And that he had learned the hard way that it's not about never making mistakes, but about being honest with yourself, and with others, about what still pulsates and what merely survives through inertia. Laura read that interview one random afternoon, while sipping tea on the sofa. Seeing those words, he smiled, his eyes slightly moist. It wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. There was something powerful in seeing that, despite everything, they had become better people. That pain, when accepted and worked through, can transform into strength to avoid repeating patterns, to build truer relationships. He closed the newspaper, walked to his bookshelf, picked up a new notebook, and wrote in the first lines, "Some loves are seeds, others, lessons. Both blossom, but each in their own way. A few months later, Laura was invited to an international conference on romantic relationships and literature. She was one of the keynote speakers. Before leaving, she spent a few days alone in a country house she rented to reconnect. There, amidst tall trees and absolute silence, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. She slept without guilt, woke without anxiety. She walked the trails barefoot, as if rediscovering her own existence. At the end of her stay, she wrote a letter to herself, sealing a cycle that lasted longer than it should have, but ended exactly when she needed it to. On the other side of the world, Daniel and Helena were planning a small ceremony to celebrate their love. Not a traditional wedding, but a promise between two adults who had chosen each other in their most honest form. They planned to gather a few friends, on a late afternoon, with soft music and good food. Helena once asked if he would like to invite someone from the past. He smiled, hugged her, and said that the past had already been honored, and that now everything that mattered was there, in the present they were building with such care. Laura received the informal invitation days later, through a mutual friend. She wasn't surprised, nor offended. She felt something akin to longing, but for a time that no longer belonged to her. She decided not to go. Instead, he sent a short message, wishing her well. He didn't expect a reply, but he received one: "Thank you. Life is truly a hard school, but some lessons change us forever." She read it with a smile, looked up to the sky, and silently thanked everyone for everything she had experienced. Because despite the pain, the grief, the loss, she had learned to love better, including herself. And on that silent afternoon, as she packed her bags for the conference that would change the course of her career, she understood that life, however hard, still offers redemption. Not the redemption of returning to what was lost, but of rebuilding herself with the pieces that remained. The past still existed within her, but now no longer as a wound, but as a scar. A permanent reminder that love is not enough on its own, it must be cultivated, chosen, nurtured. And that when it isn't, it teaches. And when it teaches, it transforms. And when it transforms, it liberates. Days after Laura received the informal invitation, she embarked for the international conference with a mixture of anxiety and an almost unprecedented serenity. It was the first time she had left the country alone since the end of her marriage, but this time she wasn't running away from anything. She was heading toward something new, toward a moment where she could share her story not as a victim or a villain, but as a woman who had fallen, learned, and, above all, rebuilt herself. The plane ride was long, and during those hours suspended in the sky, she reflected on the paths that had led her there. The mistakes, the losses, the silence, the reunions, and what remained of it all. When she arrived at the hotel, she received a bouquet of wildflowers and a note that simply said, "You are stronger than you think. With love, a grateful reader." The note was unsigned, but it carried more meaning than any name could offer. It was a sign that her pain had already become a bridge to other lives. At the event, her talk was scheduled for the second day, and the auditorium was full. When she took the stage, she felt her heart race, but not from fear. It was a raw emotion, as if she were about to rip her chest open and reveal the most human part of her. She began by telling not a story of love, but of loss. She spoke of expectations, of complacency, of the illusion that love can survive through inertia. She spoke of the woman who believed she deserved more, without realizing she also offered less. And of the man who, despite loving deeply, remained silent until he had nothing left to offer. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Some people wept quietly. Others stared at the stage, as if seeing a reflection of themselves. In the end, she said that true love doesn't end suddenly. It dies slowly, when we stop choosing the other. And that, as cruel as it sounds, there's a painful beauty in understanding this in time to avoid repeating it. Meanwhile, Daniel and Helena were spending the weekend away in a small seaside town. They had decided to take this trip before the ceremony, as a low-key commitment rehearsal. They stayed in a charming inn facing the ocean, where the windows opened onto a view that calmed even the loudest thoughts. They walked hand in hand along the sand, talking about their new house, the idea of getting a dog, and how they wanted the next few years to be. That evening, they sat in front of a makeshift fireplace with wine and oldies, and Helena, with a more serious look than usual, asked Daniel if he believed the love he felt now was greater or just different from the one he once felt for Laura. He took a while to answer. He looked into the fire, took a deep breath, and said that love, when it matures, stops competing with the past. That with Laura, it had been intense, yes, but also painful. That there, with her, he felt whole, not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of peace. Helena didn't smile or cry. She simply leaned closer and rested her head on his shoulder, silently. The answer he sought was in that gesture, in that pause. It was enough. On her way back from the conference, still at the airport, Laura was approached by a man with gray hair and age-marked eyes. He said he'd been following her writing since its first publication and had traveled only to hear her speak in person. He didn't try to flirt, didn't ask for anything. He simply thanked her. He said he'd reunited with his daughter after years because of one of her articles. Laura was touched. He offered her coffee, and they spent hours talking about children, loss, and reconciliation. When he left a card with a number, no pressure, just a gesture of someone who understood the value of a simple and genuine connection. Laura tucked the card into her purse, making no promises. But she smiled at the idea that perhaps something new could still emerge, without the urgency of passion, but with the depth of maturity. A few days later, after returning, she received a call from a radio show that wanted to interview her live about the experiences that inspired her writing. At first, she hesitated. She knew that some of the audience was still speculating about her personal life, her ex-husband, and the end of her marriage. But she decided to go. And when asked about regrets, she responded with a calmness that surprised even the interviewer. She said she regretted it, yes, but not the decision to separate, but rather having ignored for so long the signs that something needed to change. That it wasn't the breakup that made her suffer, but the indifference that preceded it. And that today, seeing her ex-husband happy with another woman, she doesn't feel envy or jealousy, but relief. Because she knows he's being loved the way he always deserved. Across town, Daniel overheard the interview while driving. He recognized the voice immediately, and at certain points, he slowed down just to better grasp each word. When she said the relief came from knowing he was being loved as he deserved, he felt a lump in his throat. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of silent gratitude. Arriving home, Helena was in the garden, reading. He hugged her tightly from behind, as if confirming a choice. She laughed, turned to him, and asked why he'd made such a sudden gesture. He simply replied that he'd heard something beautiful on the radio. He didn't need to say anything else. She understood. Over time, the two couples, or rather, the two destinies that were once one, continued to drift apart naturally, like leaves carried by different currents of the same river. Daniel and Helena formalized their union in an intimate sunset ceremony, with close friends and sincere promises. Laura, in turn, was invited to publish her first novel, loosely based on her story, but with fictional layers that allowed her to retell the events with the freedom that literature allows. The book was a success. And at one of the book signings, a young woman with curly hair approached, saying that she had returned to writing poetry after reading her book. Laura signed it, moved, and said that perhaps that was her greatest love now, transforming pain into art, and art into healing. There was a day, months later, when the two crossed paths again, by accident. It was a cloudy morning in a small cafe. Laura was alone, writing on her laptop. Daniel walked in with Helena, looking for a table in the back. Their eyes met for a second. She raised her head slightly in greeting. He smiled discreetly. Helena noticed, but didn't ask anything. She already knew his past, but understood that his look wasn't an invitation, nor regret. It was simply respect. And perhaps a final acknowledgement, that they had experienced something that had left its mark, but that didn't define who they were now. On his way out, Daniel left a folded piece of paper on her table, without Helena noticing. Laura, curious, opened it as soon as the waiter brought it. It was a phrase written in his ancient, unmistakable handwriting: "We only learn to love properly when we stop being afraid of being forgotten." She smiled, closed her laptop, asked for the check, and left with her heart at peace. It no longer ached. It didn't burn. It was just a memory. A good memory, reminding her of who she once was, and of everything she had to leave behind to finally find herself again. Time followed its course like a river that never repeats its waters, and with it the characters in this story also continued to sail, each on their own bank, under different currents, different tides. The house where Daniel and Helena lived was already filled with shared memories, with silent rituals that reflected complicity. On Sundays, they prepared breakfast together, laughed at small, insignificant things, and made plans, not as someone desperately dreaming about the future, but as someone building a solid present, aware that happiness is not constant euphoria, but rather constancy in respect and presence. The connection between them took root with each mutual choice, with each comfortable silence, with each light touch that said more than any speech. And it was precisely on a sunny afternoon, while they were organizing a new guest room, that Helena surprised him with an unexpected question: if he would have the courage to write a book about everything he had experienced before her. Daniel stared at her for a moment, and with a serene smile, said that perhaps he would write one day, but that right now he preferred to continue writing about what he experienced with her, not what was left behind. Helena said nothing more. But that gesture, that response, was like a definitive seal that she was not competing with memories, but rather walking alongside a man who had closed all the necessary cycles before choosing to begin again. Shortly thereafter, the two adopted a 5-year-old girl from a broken home, full of fear and silence. And it was with her that they learned that true love is not the kind that arrives ready-made, but the kind that is built with patience. Daniel, watching her sleep in Helena's arms, understood once and for all why he had to go through everything he had. Because some forms of love don't come when we want them, but when we are ready to deserve them. Laura, on the other hand, was also experiencing a new kind of life. Her book had become an absolute success, but more than the awards and invitations she began receiving, what touched her most was the way her story resonated in the hearts of others. She received letters, messages, and stories from women and men who had changed their lives after understanding, through her words, that love should not be neglected. She was invited to teach at a university, and there she rediscovered her passion for teaching, for active listening, and for the power of sharing. Despite all her merits, there was something that silently bothered her: emotional loneliness. Not for lack of suitors or opportunities, but because, deep down, Laura knew that, after Daniel, no love had managed to touch her with the same depth. It wasn't through comparison or idealization, but through recognition. She clearly realized that the bond she had with him was genuine, but that she hadn't known how to nurture it. This awareness was what made her more selective, more careful, and also more solitary. One autumn morning, walking alone along a trail, she ran into the man from the airport, the one who had left the card months before. By chance, or perhaps fate, they were in the same place, for the second time. They talked like old acquaintances, like someone who already shares the same silence. He invited her to lunch, and at that lunch, for the first time in years, Laura felt like smiling without restraint. It was a calm, mature joy, without promises. Over time, she allowed herself to get to know him better, and even though she never felt for him what she once felt for Daniel, there was a lightness between them that didn't hurt. And perhaps, she thought, love was also like this, not losing yourself, but adding yourself. The love she now experienced wasn't epic, it wasn't overwhelming, but it was clean, sincere, and above all, possible. Once, alone at home, she found an old box filled with objects from the past. Photographs, letters, notes exchanged with Daniel. She didn't cry. With each memory, she felt a pang of tenderness and a strange pride in having survived it all without hardening. She picked up one of the papers and reread the sentence he had written: "We only learn to love properly when we stop being afraid of being forgotten." It resonated differently now. Because she had finally understood. The fear of being forgotten had made her make rash decisions and try to cling to what no longer existed. But now, she no longer needed to be remembered to exist. She existed in her choices, in her journey, in her reconstruction. Years passed. Stories were revisited only through memory. Daniel and Helena watched their daughter grow up, now running through the hallways with drawings in her hands and curious questions. One afternoon, the little girl found an old painting stored in the basement, a portrait of the woman who chose the void. Upon seeing it, she innocently asked who it was. Daniel looked at the painting, remained silent for a few seconds, and tenderly replied that it was a very important woman, who once taught him the value of caring for those you love. The girl smiled, ran back to play, and Daniel remained there, alone, for a few minutes. There was no sadness, only a silent reverence for everything he had experienced. Helena called him from the kitchen, and he went upstairs. There was a cake in the oven and a table set for the three of them. This was his reality now. And he was happy. In an interview, Laura was asked about the love of her life. She looked at the reporter, thought for a few seconds, and replied that the love of her life was the one she lost because she didn't know how to value him. She said this without drama, without exaggerated guilt, but with the lucidity of someone who understood the weight of choices. She added that sometimes, the love of our life isn't the one who stays, but the one who transforms us, even with their departure. The reporter, surprised, asked if she still saw him. She smiled and replied, "He lives in another time now, in another story. And I, in mine. And everything is fine the way it is." And that's how this story ends. Not with miraculous reunions, nor with forced romantic endings. But with truths exposed, with hearts healed, with paths that ran parallel but left deep marks on each other. Because some losses teach us more than any victory. Because love, when not respected, exacts a high price. And because, in the end, we're all searching for the same thing, someone who will remain even when the shine of the newness fades. But to deserve that someone, you have to be that someone too. If you've made it this far, please comment on your thoughts on this story. Which part touched you most? Do you believe Laura deserved a second chance or that Daniel did the right thing by moving on? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to hear more stories like this, real, painful, yet transformative stories. Remember, betrayal destroys families, homes, futures, and especially trust. Love cannot survive lies. The channel does not support any type of betrayal. The goal of our stories is to warn, move, and inspire reflection. May this story serve as a mirror and, perhaps, a gateway to more sincere new beginnings.